I wanted to unpack a little bit. There's some stuff that's going to emerge into the world soon, and it involves some hypotheses that are born of the observations that Zach and I and others were able to make down in Panama on this recent trip. And as longtime viewers, we have a lot of new viewers, but they're longtime viewers who know that we are very careful about the rules of engagement, for lack of a better term, that one has to apply when dealing with scientific hypotheses. And I want to just remind people a little bit about how those rules work. And then I want to talk about two concepts that I believe are going to become important in the dialogue about what's going on in the border crossings in Texas, the crossings that are taking place in Darien, and the migration that is happening in northern South America and all of Central America. So the first thing I want to discuss is a hypothesis is a plausible explanation for something that is observed. You are supposed to formulate every hypothesis that could explain a given pattern when you are trying to sort what might be there. So to say that something is a hypothesis doesn't mean that you believe it's true. In fact, there should be a maximum of one hypothesis for any given observation that you think is more likely true than not. And there may not even be one of those, right? A maximum of one which you believe in. And you might call that my hypothesis, but that's an ambiguous term.
Or your preferred hypothesis.
Right, my preferred hypothesis, or you could separately say this is a hypothesis I think is likely to be true. Still remains to be tested.
But here are a bunch of other hypotheses for the same observed phenomenon.
Right. So the fact that somebody advances a hypothesis doesn't mean they think this is the case. And this is a place people get very sloppy. And the fact that you and I are careful about the term hypothesis. Most people, even people who are scientifically very rigorous, are often sloppy about the distinction between hypothesis and theory, and they treat them as synonyms. And so this sort of blunt instrument that we've been left with means that we get tangled up. We need to be able to talk about what might be going on without saying that we think it's going on. And then we need to separately be able to say, actually, this one I suspect is probably true. And that's a separate level of belief.
I hear a couple of embedded hypotheses, or rather, embedded with one another, within one another. The one from a couple of decades ago that you hypothesized then, was that the one-child policy, whether intentionally or not, will serve to create a standing army that will then be, ready. And furthermore, you have a hypothesis that, having seen what you have just seen in Panama a week or so ago, that it feels like there are two migrations happening, and that one of them is indeed a primarily Chinese migration of primarily military-aged people, of primarily men,
who are unforthcoming about what they are doing, in contrast to every other person we met.
And everything indeed about that migration is different in some way, and that is hard to point to, because if you're just at the border of Texas and Mexico seeing people come across, everyone looks the same. I mean, it's a very, very diverse group of migrants, but you can't tell the difference at that point as you can in the Darien, because the camps look different, the way they're being treated is different, the way the secrecy is different, everything is different, right? But once you combine everyone later on, once everyone gets funneled together at the crossings, it's hard to tell. What might be an alternative explanation? What might an alternative hypothesis be to explain not the one-child policy, what was that about, but to explain what you actually saw in Panama with these different kinds of camps, these different demographic makeups, the different secrecy, the different treatment, etc.
Another explanation would be that either with a wink from the Chinese Communist Party or evading its surveillance, that people fleeing China were looking for opportunity in the U.S., and that because they have lived under a totalitarian regime, their reluctance to talk is a reflex based on having been surveilled, not knowing.
That explains a tiny piece of the difference. Doesn't explain the disparity in wealth and organization and resources that seem to be coming not just from the people, but also from the UN.
No, it could be. It could. I don't think it does because
Okay, no, fine. But like, I want to hear an alternative hypothesis.
Sure. No, I think it's a good exercise, and it may well be. But the fact of Chinese culture being remote from not all, but most of the other cultures that are migrating might mean that just from the point of view of delivering services to Chinese people, it might be easier to organize them. If there was a large number of them, China's a large source population, large number of migrants motivated by something like economic opportunity or fleeing oppression or whatever it was, they might end up in Panama.
The alternative hypothesis I hear has something to do with there's more Chinese migrants who, maybe because they're coming from longer ways away, they either already knew each other or have had time to know each other. They don't share a language with any of the other migrants, which would also be the true for the Afghans and the Yemenis, but not for like the Venezuelans versus the Colombians versus
but there's
the
some
Bolivians,
critical
whatever.
mass of
There's some
people.
critical mass of people. They share a language, they share a culture, they share the journey up until this point. And that economies of scale being what they are, they can join forces. But that still doesn't explain, unless the San Vicente camp that you saw was an outlier. It was just like, that's the only camp that looks like that, and that's the one you saw. Like, why is that one in the middle of nowhere? Not organic, totally synthetic, totally rectangular, as opposed to having grown up from where people, emerge from the forest bedraggled and tired. And why is there a long line of buses there waiting? Maybe that's because of the relative wealth of the Chinese. But there's still a piece that feels like that the only alternative hypothesis so far that we've got on the table, the evidence that you saw doesn't explain it as well.
Yeah, that's the problem with it.
Yeah.
I would also say there's a part that is just a feeling.
Sure.
The
Yep.
hostility, I know what it's
From
like.
the migrants.
From the migrants.
Yeah.
I know what it's like when somebody does not feel at liberty to talk. They want to talk, but they don't feel that it is safe.
Sure.
That is very different than what we felt. These were people who viewed us dimly. Mm-hmm. They did not want to talk because it makes no sense to share information with us, right?
Yeah.
It's all downside. That's what it felt like. Mm-hmm. So there's that.
Yeah.
And, I also just can't explain.
Which is rare. Like, we've run into that sometimes in our travels, but usually if you have an openness to you and make some attempt at understanding where you are and the culture you're in and the language, and just you don't need to be anywhere close to fluent, but just like make some attempt to be like, hi, I'm a human being, you are too. I'm really interested in the fact that I'm in your home and I want to know more about it. Almost everyone has an interest in that.
Yeah, even more. Imagine that you had decided to up and leave your home culture and you were going to America, and Americans show up in Panama interested in your story. Mm-hmm. It is not a slam dunk that you would be anything other than fascinated by this first taste of your
Maybe
new culture.
concerned at first that this isn't what it appears. Like, oh, what are you? What is this? Are you the feds? Whatever,
Sure.
right? But if not that, then interested. I would
Yeah,
think.
I mean, and we clearly weren't. I
Yeah.
mean, just our style of dress and all would have suggested otherwise. So anyway, the thing did feel very off. And in any case, yes, multiple embedded hypotheses, a kind of Trojan migration is one of them, that there's a natural, organic, economic migration, and then there's some other migration traveling within it. And here in the U.S., the point is, well, what do you think of the migrants? Like, well, which migrants?
Yeah.
So,
That's it. That's the punchline, right? Like, what do you think of what's going on at the border?
Yeah.
What do you think of the migrants? What do you think of what's going on at the border? I think there are a lot of things going on at the border.
Yeah, I think there's more than one thing going on at the border. And I'm against all of it because I'm an American and I know that it's one thing for a small number of people to enter the country. It's another thing for hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of new Americans to arrive, or de facto Americans, right? The point is, was our economy humming along so well that it can just simply absorb that number of people and not directly rob the people who are struggling in our economy already? No way. So I'm against it for that reason, but I'm absolutely compassionate with respect to the fact that these people are fleeing something real, right? And, I'm as an American, I'm honored that they would think that America was still a good place to go. As we're watching it collapse, it's interesting that a lot of people still view it in terms that I think, frankly, probably need an update. But anyway, I'm against that at one level, but it's all human. Right. And then there's a question of, did our enemies figure something out about this migration, either as an opportunity or did they seed it through the international community, right, in order to cloak what they're up to? Again, it's a hypothesis, but it's one that we really need to think carefully about. And I would just say one last thing. There's one more hypothesis related to this. Maybe there are two, but there's one that I want to put on the table here. When I did my episode with the folks from the U.S. military who had been thrown
military
out
whistleblowers.
or threatened, right?
2 episodes, right? You spoke to several people in 2 different episodes about the effects that the vaccine mandates had on them.
Right. And some of these people had been driven out, and some of them were fighting to maintain their careers. But in any case, this looked hostile to American interests, to take some of our best people and drive them out because they were reluctant about vaccines that, frankly, a reasonable person had every reason to be reluctant about. And I said 2 things at the time. One is, I said, you know what? That is going to leave behind a force that is compliant to immoral orders, and that's frightening. But 2, this one way that this could come about is that somebody could have noticed our pay-for-play political system, and instead of corrupting it for some corporate interest that was bad for Americans, they could have corrupted it for one of our international antagonists' interests and just basically induced us to harm ourselves, right? Vaccinating our entire military, right? That wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
There was no defense for that. These were, in general, healthier than average Americans, younger than average Americans. These were not people jeopardized by COVID. And giving them something, even if it had shown itself to be perfectly harmless in the trials, nobody knew what the long-term impact was. That was a dumb thing to do. So why would we do a dumb thing like that, right? It's not inobvious that there's a risk there. And so anyway, the hypothesis I put on the table then was that if you have a corrupt political system where it does the bidding of whoever ponies up the dough, then what's to stop our enemies from ponying up the dough, right? And if you think there is something to stop them, like we have laws against that, then the point is, okay, well, where are the court cases that indicate that those laws have been applied in a way that has frustrated the enemies that have undoubtedly tried it?
Yeah.
And if those court cases don't exist, then my contention is you'd be a fool to think this never happened. And we don't know what effect it has. But anytime we, savage ourselves, we should ask ourselves the question of, did we do it because we were confused, or did we do it because we were induced to do it? So anyway, another hypothesis.